Today we're going to build a website for a business that's practical, like a law firm, in space. It's like a normal law firm, only better. The site is filled with clever prose, the likes of which we haven't seen since Conrad, Wolf, and Dostoevsky, which coincidentally is the name of an actual law firm. We're going to move fairly quickly, and some of this might seem tedious, showing every single change to every single value, but we're fanatical about making sure we don't brush over anything. You can skip around this content or speed it up, mute it if you'd like, if that's your thing. We've all done it. It's okay. Dale edits most of the audio on his system on mute anyway. Focusing on 5 main things. We're covering 5 core parts. Layout, how we're designing, styling, and developing for all devices right on the page using the designer. We'll cover the CMS, how we're managing content. Collection pages, we'll design full pages for each team member, practice area, and blog post. Collection lists, we'll use these to link to those full pages. And finally, we'll do organization, how the site is structured and linked together, how we set SEO titles and meta descriptions. And when we're done with that, as a bonus, we'll build the rotational parallax we see here on the homepage, which of course responds to the position of the pointer. And as we're covering these topics, keep in mind, we have tons of detailed videos and guides for everything from the basics of Flexbox to advanced triggers and animations and typography and SEO. All of this is on Webflow University. So if you need to brush up on anything or reference some of the more advanced content out there, it's always at your disposal. But let's start today with layout. This is a blank project, and our goal is to turn this into a not blank project. So we can go over to the Add panel, and we'll go down and drag in a section. And that's it. We've turned this into a not blank project. Let's keep going. Now, before we go any further, let's make sure to drag in some assets. These are 2 images, a logo, and a background image we'll be using later in the project. But for now, with our section selected, let's create a class, and we can call this Home Hero. And for our Home Hero section, let's give it some type of height. We can do this in pixels, like 500 pixels, or we can do it in other values like VH, 60 VH here. And what we can do once we've set that value is put in a heading. We can drop any elements inside. In this case, we're double-clicking to edit the heading, and we're calling this a firm specializing in legal matters that are out of this world, which is a pun, a space pun. Let's continue by putting a button in our section. We can create a class for this as well, call it button. And once that class is tied to the element, we can duplicate. We're just copying and pasting here so that each of these button elements has the button class applied. Let's name these. We're double-clicking to name each of these. We have Learn More, Practice Areas, and of course a third button for Contact Us. All right, so once this is done, we can select the section and start setting up our layout. In this case, we're using Flexbox to vertically align to center all of our content. But before we continue, let's make a critical change to our body. This is our body all pages tag. And changes to our style panel here, changes to styles in the body all pages tag, won't just apply to this page, this particular page in the project, but it will apply as a default for all pages that we end up creating in this project. So let's continue. In this case, we're making changes to the font color. This is the font color for the body all pages tag. And we can select from any number of fonts in our project, but we can also go to our project settings. And from our project settings, we can always navigate on over to the Fonts tab. And here we can use Adobe Typekit or custom fonts. In this case, we're going to scroll down and select one of the Google fonts. And once we make our selection, we can select variants we'd like to include for that specific font. Here we're selecting a number of different font weights and font styles. Once we're done making our selection for fonts, we can go back to the designer. In this case, we're going to go back to our body all pages tag. Why? Because we're not done switching away from Arial yet. And so we can solve that by scrolling down and making the selection of the new font we added from Google Fonts. Once we do that, that changes our default font throughout the project. Let's drag in a div block here. This div block, we're going to create a class. We're going to call it Home Hero Wrapper. We're going to use this to organize some of these elements we've already created. We'll drag in our heading. We'll drag in our buttons. We'll do these one at a time. Keep in mind, as we drag in buttons, everything here is visual. So that means if we need to reorder any of these buttons, we simply drag and drop right into position. So once we have our buttons organized the way we want our buttons organized, let's select our Home Hero wrapper. And we can use Flex Layout on these as well. In this case, we'll select vertical layout, and we'll make sure everything is justified and aligned to center. Now, for our buttons, we can create a separate div block for those as well. We can create a class, call it button block, and in this case, we'll drag our buttons right inside. That means it's immune to those flex layout properties we just set on its parent element. So we have learn more, we have practice areas, we have contact us in its own button block. Let's style our buttons. We can start by making a change to the font color. Let's make the font light gray. We can make an adjustment to font size, just like you'd expect, using up and down arrows to adjust things like letter spacing, character spacing. We can also go and make changes to margin. Making margin changes is as simple as dragging to the left and right, but we can hold down Option or Alt and drag to adjust opposing sides at once. And we could do the same thing for padding, adjust the space on the inside. In this case, we're adjusting the top and bottom padding, and now we're adjusting the left and right padding. Again, holding Option or Alt to adjust opposing sides at the same time. Let's make a change to the background color. And we can choose black for now. We can also make adjustments to opacity, bring it down to about 60% here. And let's go ahead and create an outline. And this outline, we can use a white color for some contrast, and we can drop the opacity on that as well. And it's not just the none state that we're able to style here. We can make a number of changes to various states for various element types based on the styles we're setting here. In this case, we're going to make changes, a number of changes, to the hover state. Now, the hover state is based on the none state, so we're inheriting those styles we just set on our buttons. In this case, on hover, we might want the text color to turn to white, so when we hover over, it now turns to white. Let's add another effect here. We can do a text shadow, and in this case, we're going to use a shadow color of white to add a subtle glow effect. That way, on hover, we're able to create a glow around each of the text characters. Let's set the blur to something a little bit wider, like 12, and now on hover, we can see not only does the text color turn white, we get the glow as well. Let's make adjustments now to the outline. So on hover, we want our outline to become full white. The problem is, in the designer right now, these element edges are visible, so we can actually toggle those element edges, and now we can see that our visibility does indeed look great, and put the element edges back on. Going back to our none state, we can add transitions. Now, a transition is going to create a state change that covers a particular period. In this case, we can adjust that. It's 200 milliseconds by default, but we can animate over 500 milliseconds. Really can put anything we want in there. And we're creating a number of changes. In this case, we're creating another one for our text shadow. We're doing a different transition for each style that we've affected. So now when we hover over our buttons, we can see that the text shadow and the text color are indeed transitioning over 500 milliseconds. Let's keep going. We'll add another transition. In this case, we're going to affect the border, and we need to adjust that 200 milliseconds again here to 500 milliseconds. And finally, if we go to preview this, if we go to preview mode, we can see our hover effect in action. Each of the buttons responds just as we've styled them. Let's continue by selecting any of our buttons and going back to the hover state. In this case, we might want to make a change to the background color as well. Remember, we created a 60% opacity at first. We can just crank this to 100. And on hover, we can see now that it becomes 100% full color. But the transition hasn't been added. If we try to add the transition in our hover state, we can't, so let's go back over to our none state, and we'll create a transition. This time, we'll scroll down and affect the background color, since we made a change to that background color, and we'll close out of that transition. All of our transitions for all of our styles that we just created have been set. Let's select our heading, and in this case, let's style our heading. We'll create a class. We can call the class something creative like big heading. And from here, we can make a number of changes to typography. In this case, we're selecting a light variant of this font, and we'll make some adjustments by using the up and down arrows on font size. Same thing with line height here. And we can move on to more interesting things, such as character spacing. We can just type in a value. We can adjust all caps. And we can also make adjustments to the element itself. For instance, Shift-Enter can knock down a bit of text to a new line, and we can highlight any bit of text and wrap it with a span. The span, of course, lets us style independently. In this case, we'll call this one Mega Focus. We'll call this span Mega Focus. And for Mega Focus, we're going to make a font selection. We'll create extra bold weight here. And we'll also increase the font color brightness to full white. And we'll go ahead and select our Home Hero section to center the text. Of course, that's going to pass down. That will be inherited by its children text objects. Let's make an adjustment to this button block. We're going to add some top margin here to give it some breathing room, some space. And on our Home Hero, we can set a background. In this case, a background image. And we're going to pop in that image we dragged in before, one of those assets we dragged in before. And we can make a number of changes to this background image. In this case, we're going to center it and set it to cover. And now it's sized perfectly. Quick note about Flexbox is it enables us to set properties on its children. Lets us set styles, layout properties on the children. So we can make adjustments here and actually align to the bottom and then add some padding so that we're able to control this Home Hero wrapper we created in terms of layout. Now, when we make changes to something like line height, you can see everything happens from the bottom. It respects those Flexbox properties. Let's continue by adding now a navbar. Since our main hero section is completed, we'll drag in a navbar, which we can do anywhere. In this case, we're going to drag it right into the body, right at the top of the page. And we could go over and create a class for this, but in this case, we'll go ahead and make a change to the background color. We'll set the background color for our navbar to black. And by doing that, you can see our navbar class was automatically created. Classes are automatically created once we style an element. Let's continue by dragging in a logo. And our logo is now inside this brand link block, and we can just grab it and resize. Just eyeball to see what looks right. Now, we also have 3 nav links. They're not very visible right now. Let's, instead of creating a new class, let's build based on our button class, the one we created for each of the buttons below. And we can apply this manually to each and every button that comes set with the navbar, but in this case, we'll create a combo class. A combo class lets us style on top of the button class, using the button class as a base, and it won't modify. None of the style changes will modify the original button class. So let's duplicate. We're just copying and pasting here. And just like the buttons before, every single one of these elements, every button here, is holding the button class with the nav combo class. We're just going in, double-clicking, and making changes to the text. So we have each of our 5 main sections for our website. With any of these selected, we can adjust top margin. We can also go down because we don't need it and get rid of the border, change the style on the border to none, which will be much more fitting for the navbar. Now, keep in mind, if we select any of our original buttons, because that's the base class, changes to this, like font here, will actually show up in that combo class as well. Keep that in mind as we're styling using combo classes. For now, let's continue making other changes, like selecting this container here. We'll call it nav container. We'll create a class called nav container, and we'll set a minimum on this to 100%. That's going to let us take full width for the content inside that navbar. And we can grab the navbar itself, and with the navbar itself selected, we can make changes to padding. We can do this independently, as you see here, or we can just hold down Shift and drag to adjust all sides at once. In this case, adding enough breathing room, about 30 pixels, seems just right. We can do the same thing for our button nav, our combo class, and make sure the spacing looks great there too. Finally, on the navbar, let's create a lower border. We can affect just one side, and we can choose a color that works great here. And rather than guessing at this color every time, we can go ahead and create a swatch. We can check to make this a global swatch, which means if we end up changing this color in the future, any place that we've used this swatch, if we change that swatch color, will also be affected by the change in color. Let's continue with our footer. Footer, in this case, we're using just a simple div block, setting a height of 300 pixels, just as a standard right now. Let's drag in from the add panel, let's drag in a text block. And this text block is going to serve as our copyright notice. In this case, we're going to use Flexbox on our div block, our footer here, to center the content. We can double click to edit the text and type a copyright. In this case, copyright Astro Law Firm, all rights reserved, basic copyright notice here. And we can actually grab from our asset panel, we can grab our logo again, which is unbearably large. So let's resize that. And by default, our flex items are being arranged horizontally because we never chose vertical under flex layout. So let's choose vertical under flex layout. Let's continue by grabbing a text link from our add panel. We'll just grab a text link and drag it in. We'll use this for some of our footer links. Now, you might notice that nothing right here is visible. We can double click and edit this text and write Facebook, but you really can't read this, and that's okay. It's time to style the text link. And in this case, we can use our button class again. For button, we are seeing an underline right here with the text link, so we can turn that off for all buttons to make sure we don't get underlines. But we'll do what we did with the nav and create a combo class here. In this case, we'll call the combo class footer. And we'll set the background color to transparent. Now, if we go on over in states over to hover, we can see that transparent now carries through there as well, so we don't have to make any changes to our hover state in terms of background. And if we turn off our element edges, we can still see there are some outlines visible. So let's turn the element edges back on. With our button selected, we'll go over to Style, Border Style, and we'll turn off our edges. We'll turn off those borders. Now, let's copy and paste. Again, the button class with the footer combo class is applied to each of these, and we can double-click to make changes to each of these. Of course, in addition to Twitter and Instagram, we have MySpace Law Firm, and we can make the last one a Contact Us button, which, when we build it, will route us to our contact page. So, we're making a lot of progress here with our footer. Let's drag in a div block to organize some of these buttons. We'll drag in Facebook, we'll drag in Twitter, we'll drag each of these in one by one so that we can horizontally align everything. And we can use this div block. We can use this div block that now contains each of our buttons. We can use it to add some breathing room. So in this case, we're going to add some padding to both sides, the top and bottom. And that way, everything breathes a little more. We have some blank space, and we can of course select any of these buttons with the combo class, the footer combo class applied, and we can adjust spacing there as well. For our footer copyright, we can make changes to typography. In fact, it was Albert Einstein, when working as a patent clerk, that originally pioneered the tactic of lowering the brightness on a footer copyright. Let's grab our footer, and you can see we can make color changes to this. Choose any color. In this case, we're going to do a solid black color for really high contrast. And just like we did to the navbar, let's set an upper border. And we can use our hairline color that we used for the navbar's lower border. And that looks great. Keep in mind, we did set a height before. We can go into the height and remove that style, and we can have the height automatically calculated based on padding. We can add some padding to the top and bottom. But where this gets really interesting is when we start looking at different views. In this case, we're in tablet view, and we can grab the edge here and take a look at responsiveness based on different browser widths, different device widths. And we might want to grab our big heading here and make changes to font size or line height. And we can kind of grab the edge here and see how that responds, making micro adjustments visually. And as we do that, these changes are affecting tablet, they're affecting mobile landscape, and they're affecting mobile portrait, but they're not affecting the styles we made on the desktop view earlier. Let's select one of our lower buttons. In this case, we might want each of these footer buttons to take up its own line. And of course, we can center the text. Based on this, we might want to adjust the tap space inside the target. On tablet, we might not need that much, so we can decrease that inner padding on the top and bottom. Of course, if we select our div block, the div block, of course, serving as that footer, we can make adjustments to padding there as well. In this case, we're making changes to the image here, this lower logo, and 110 pixels seems good. Now that we've given attention to our footer, let's give some attention to our navbar. Let's specifically look at the menu button. Now, the menu button works if we go into preview mode here. By pressing the menu button in tablet view, we get a drop-down menu. Let's go back out of preview mode so that we can make some changes here. And we can select Open Menu and grab any of these elements to style. In this case, we're going to grab our button. Each of these buttons is the same button we styled in our navbar, of course, on desktop view. But in this case, we're going to make changes starting at the tablet breakpoint. So let's make changes starting at the tablet breakpoint, starting with turning off top margin, setting that to 0. We can also select our nav menu. Our nav menu is what holds each of these buttons, and our nav menu right now is set to a gray color. We can go down to background and choose something like black, and as with other styles, we can adjust the opacity. So we can have a slightly translucent menu bar as that comes down. We'll set that opacity here to about 77%. Really, it's based on what looks right. Of course, here we can make a change to a darker gray color, more of a slate, and we can also make changes to the buttons themselves. With any of the buttons selected, we can make them transparent. So we can see right through the buttons. They're still clickable, they're still tappable. So if we go in and preview this and press our menu button, we can see right through the button and everything works as expected. Let's go back to the designer out of preview mode and select our menu button. We can actually style the menu button. So let's create a class called menu button. We can press open menu and go back over to the style panel. And from the style panel, we can affect things like the color of the menu button. We're making it black here. In fact, we can go down and make it transparent, completely transparent. And as we go in and toggle under navbar settings, as we open and close our menu, we can see that the menu button stays transparent. We can also make a change to the duration. That's going to affect how long it takes to open and then subsequently close the menu. So let's go back out of preview mode. Let's go over to our navbar settings, open our menu again, and from our navigator, we can select our nav menu. Why? Because we can add a little breathing room above and below where those buttons are by adjusting padding. Simply eyeballing to see what padding value looks right. Now we have a little more breathing room when this opens and closes. And before we go too far, let's grab by the edge of this tablet view. Let's grab our edge and test the responsiveness. Of course, this is looking a lot better now. Our nav menu is looking a lot better, but we can grab any of these buttons and align it, for instance, so it looks a little bit closer to our logo. You can see each of these buttons is affected. If we go into mobile landscape and of course mobile portrait, we can see that we might need to make an adjustment to the padding on each of those. Of course, changes to mobile landscape don't go back up to tablet, but they do go back down to mobile portrait. Changes cascade down in terms of view, not back up. Let's add a box shadow. And what we're going to do is add a little bit of blur to this box shadow so that we have a nice bit of differentiation between the nav menu and the background objects. 28 looks pretty great. We'll go back in, make a slight change, darken this up a little bit, really eyeballing it to find out what works best visually. Let's go into preview mode. And in preview mode, we'll take a final look at how this menu bar drops down, looks great, and how it comes back up. Same thing in mobile landscape. We can test it out in mobile landscape as well. Finally, we'll do the same thing in mobile portrait, what it looks like on portrait mode on most mobile phones. So let's go out of preview mode and make some more changes because we're not done quite yet. Let's talk height. And we set 60 VH as that minimum height to start with, but we can really put anything here. So for tablet, we might want 400 pixels or a little bit more than that. We can eyeball it. And for mobile landscape, we'll change that minimum perhaps a little bit lower to something like 380 pixels. Really, this is based on what works best for each device range. Of course, make a change to padding, lower padding down to 24 or so. Looks a lot better than that thicker padding did a moment ago. And we can also change our buttons. By changing the display setting to block, these buttons each are on their own line. This is very similar to what we did in the footer. You can set the width here on the button block to 100%. That's maybe a little wide for mobile landscape, maybe 60% is more fitting. And we can make adjustments to our lower margin. That provides that gap for the buttons. But keep in mind, because those are the base buttons, we're going to undo that margin for everything we applied a combo class to. That, of course, includes our footer and our nav combo classes. We're simply setting each of those, the value for that bottom margin, to 0. Test that responsiveness. It's looking pretty good. Now, our home hero section, that image we have in the background, we can simply add an overlay to increase contrast. Now, that overlay can be any color we want. In this case, we're going to keep it black and have an opacity just over 50%. That looks pretty good. And we can see the text against that background now. We can also adjust our flex layout. We'll make sure to center this. And because we've done that, we can get rid of that padding we put at the bottom when we had everything aligned to the bottom. And of course, we can adjust our height. Maybe the minimum can be something more like 330 pixels for mobile landscape. And we can bring some padding back to really space this out and eyeball what looks great. With our big heading selected, we can make a change in mobile landscape, perhaps decreasing the font size, decreasing the line height, and we can go and see how that looks in mobile portrait. Now, in mobile portrait, everything's bunched up because we had set 60% in mobile landscape. 60% worked fine in mobile landscape, but that's really tight in mobile portrait. Looks a lot better at 100%. If we test that responsiveness, we're seeing good results. Everything's responding as we'd expect it to based on the values we've set in the style panel, the values we've set for each of these views, all the way from desktop down to mobile portrait. Now, in mobile landscape, you might think that navbar has a little too much breathing room. We can decrease that breathing room in mobile landscape. And in mobile portrait, we might want even less. In mobile portrait, we might want something really ridiculous like 2 pixels of padding on the top and bottom. Maybe in mobile portrait, we can just eliminate that left and right padding altogether. If we test responsiveness, it's looking a lot better. So let's go into preview mode and take a look through each of these views. If we're in mobile portrait, our drop-down menu looks pretty great. Unless, of course, text alignment is your thing, because if you look at the bottom, you might notice that the text is aligning left, and it would look a lot better if we centered it. So let's go in and center it. We'll grab the footer copyright, go to typography, and make sure that our alignment is set to center. Finally, on our footer, let's create a hover effect. And to do that, we're going to use a div block, another div block. And we're going to drag in all the major elements in our footer into that div block. And we'll do this one by one. Once we do that, we'll select that div block and we'll create a class. We're going to call this class footer hover. And this is what we're going to apply the effect to. First, let's do our flex options. Make sure that we're vertically aligning and make sure that everything is centered. Looks pretty great. And the way we're going to do this effect is simple. We're going to set the opacity, the standard opacity on the none state when we're not hovered over this, to about 45%. And when we hover over it, when we hover over the footer hover div block, we're going to go all the way up to 100%. And if you test that, you can see it goes from 45 to 100. Works fine. Let's add a transition. And that transition is going to affect opacity, and we're going to want a larger value here, maybe 1500 milliseconds. And if we go to preview mode, we can see that the footer isn't as distracting, but when we hover over anywhere inside that div block, we get a nice transition into a full 100%. Let's keep going with layout and create a new page. In this case, we're going to create a page for contact. This is going to show up blank at first, that's as expected. And what we can do is recreate our navbar. Let's drag in our navbar and we'll restyle everything, except no, we won't. Let's delete that. Instead, we'll use what we've already created on the home page. Let's select our navbar, and with that navbar selected, we can right-click on the label and press Create Symbol. We'll name the symbol navbar. When we press Create Symbol, everything inside that symbol, the symbol itself, the navbar, and all of its children elements are a symbol. Now, it's about time this div block at the bottom is named footer, so let's double-click that class and rename it main footer. And we'll right-click on the main footer label and create a symbol. We'll call the symbol footer, and now the navbar and the footer are symbols in our project. We can use them on any page, anywhere, as many times as we want. And to do that, we'll just add a symbol. We'll drag in our footer, and that's it. The footer has been added. We'll do the same thing with our navbar. The navbar has been added. And third, we'll add a section in between the navbar and the footer. We'll call this section. And on this section, we can add some healthy padding inside, some top and bottom padding. Again, we're holding down Option or Alt and dragging to adjust both sides at once. And from here, we'll add a container. The container, of course, sits inside the section, and we'll create a class, main container. And this class we can style independently. We'll create a light gray color, and we'll set a radius on our border here so we have rounded edges. And for our main container, inside of this, we can give it some company. Let's put in a heading. And this heading is whatever we want it to be. Double-click to edit, and we'll make this Contact Our Attorneys. And from here, we can select that heading and create a class. But we've already created that big heading before. Let's go in and take a look at where that color's coming. It's currently being inherited from body all pages. That's fine. We can override that in a moment. Let's give that heading some company and drag in a paragraph. That paragraph and that heading now live inside our main container. Now, with our main container selected, we can adjust the font color, and it's affecting its children as well. Those children are inheriting the font color from their parent. And we'll create dark text as a global swatch, so we can use that on different types of text objects as we're styling throughout this project. And this main container can have a variant. We're creating a combo class called centered, and we'll do just that. We'll make sure that the typography, the alignment, is centered. We'll also create some padding on the left and right, and some more padding on the bottom, and maybe some more padding on the top. And we're spacing this out so that this main container can be used not only on this page, but on other pages as well. Let's add in a contact form. We'll drag in a form block from our add panel, and in this case, we'll delete the field labels that come with that form, and instead add our own element. In this case, we're going to use a text area element, and this is going to help us give people the option to add comments if they have an optional comment they want to add. So we'll go into the input settings by double-clicking, and we'll change the placeholder for some of these to simplify everything. In this case, we'll make it required. Their name is required. The second text field, we'll go in and change that placeholder to your email. Again, this is already required. And for the third one, this text area, we'll make sure that the name is updated from a generic field to comments. And for the placeholder, we can also write comments, but we'll indicate that it's optional. In this case, we're not going to press required because it's optional. So for each of these text fields, just like all the other elements we've styled, we can create a style. We can create a class that's used to style each of these elements. And we're using the same one here for all three of them, text area, and changes to any one of them will affect the others. In this case, we'll edit the placeholder text color, the font color, and make it perhaps dark text. That looks pretty good on white. While we're at it, let's go into our main container's background color and brighten that up just a little bit so that we get that low contrast we're looking to achieve here. And for the submit button, we've already created a button class. In fact, we called it button. So let's apply that class here as well. Now, we can create a combo class just like we did for footer, just like we did for nav. In this case, we're creating one for form, and we can set its own properties, its own style properties here. In this case, we'll do 100% width, but it also has 5 pixels margin on the left and right. We can get rid of that so that it's a full width object, full width button in the form. Upper margin here, creating some nice white space. Lower margin on each of these text area elements is looking very good as well. Let's add another asset to our project. In this case, we're going to grab from Jeremy Thomas this extraordinary photograph, which is going to upload right into our assets panel. And now that it's in our assets panel, we can access it. So on our section, we'll set a background. We'll use that image we just uploaded as the background. We'll set it to cover and center, and it looks really great behind our main container. Now, to add a little bit more contrast between the container and the background, we're adding a simple drop shadow. We're going to make it super blurry, like 40 pixels, and we'll drop the opacity of that dark color on that shadow to match. Now, our form button is unique to this page. Again, it's its own combo class. So let's go in and use the eyedropper to pull one of the colors from the background. And that looks pretty good. We can adjust that using the color picker to get it just right. And once it's done, we can make some other changes like getting rid of the border and maybe increasing the font color to a full white so that the contrast looks really good. And on hover, we're still getting that glow we set on the original button. So that's our contact page. Let's link up the home page and the contact page to the actual links. In this case, the home page we want us to take to home, and the contact page we want us to take to contact. But notice on contact, it turned blue. That's because it's the current page. We're currently modifying that link. That link takes us to the contact page. Now, notice how when making that white, every single button nav turned white. What we want to do is make a higher selection. We're selecting the current state, and in that case, we'll make it white. So every time we're on a page in this project, every time we're on a page using that button nav, the current page will turn white. If we select home, home is white. If we select contact, that font color is also white. Let's look at this on different views. In tablet, it's looking pretty good. In mobile landscape, there's a little bit of crowding. That's fine. But we might want to make a change to our paragraph first. In fact, let's go into our all paragraphs tag. In all paragraphs, we can make changes to the way all paragraphs in our project behave by default without adding a class. And so we're making adjustments here. Of course, we can set line height in terms of a number. It doesn't have to be pixels. We can set that based on our dropdown, and we'll set it to something like 1.5, 1.4. 1.5 looks great. Let's go down to tablet, and perhaps we want to make a change to the font size there, 14. Same thing in mobile landscape, mobile portrait. Perhaps we want to decrease the font size there so it's more practical. We can fit more text on the screen. Mobile portrait down to 12 pixels. So we have each display, each view using a different font size. While we're in mobile landscape, let's adjust the padding on the left and right. We'll go over to tablet, back to desktop. Things are looking really good. Now, we can get really specific with this. So if we want to adjust the padding on the top, basically removing that padding, or adjust some of that padding on the bottom, removing that padding, just really tighten things up so we're not losing valuable screen real estate on mobile devices, we can do that too. In this case, we don't even need that section visible, so we'll completely eliminate the padding. For our main container, remember we have those rounded edges, that radius. Let's turn that to 0. So the main container is taking up the full dimensions of the section. So looks great on all screen sizes. We can affect some of our lower margin there on the text area objects. That looks good. Beautifully responsive on each display type. That is layout.